The supreme function of statesmanship is to provide against preventable evils. In seeking to do so, it encounters obstacles which are deeply rooted in human nature. One is that by the very order of things, such evils are not demonstrable until they have occurred. At each stage in their onset, there is room for doubt and for dispute whether they be real or imaginary. By the same token, they attract little attention in comparison with current troubles which are both indisputable and pressing. Whence the besetting temptation of all politics to concern itself with the immediate present at the expense of the future.
Absolutely beautiful. I'm pausing right now. Absolutely beautiful. This is the essence of... This is a huge political problem that still exists today. The problem is there are evils that occur, and everyone agrees we should take the person and put them in jail. But there are other evils that are predictable statistically. And then people start being hesitant on blocking these evils from occurring. Kayla, did you have anything to add?
Well, I do think that we have a problem of actually focusing on the present way too much. We're so short-sighted. We no longer engage in any type of delayed gratification, especially when using the power of the state, right? That is something that, if used well, right, it could actually, I do believe that it could actually benefit the nation. But we're not doing that. We're either playing catch up all the time, or we are just fixing the problem as it happens. We're never actually planning ahead, not anymore. And we're never going to get anywhere. We're never going to progress. And I know progress is ordered.
I'm playing at 43 seconds.
Above all, people are disposed to mistake predicting troubles for causing troubles, and even for desiring troubles. If only, they love to think, if only people wouldn't talk about it, it probably wouldn't happen. Perhaps this habit goes back to the primitive belief that the word and the thing, the name and the object, are identical. At all events, the discussion of future, grave, but with effort now, avoidable evils is the most unpopular and at the same time the most necessary occupation for the politician. Those who knowingly shirk it deserve and not infrequently receive the curses of those who come after. A week or two ago, I fell into conversation with a constituent, a middle-aged, quite ordinary working man employed in one of our nationalized industries. After a sentence or two about the weather, he suddenly said, "If I had the money to go, I wouldn't stay in this country." I made some deprecatory reply to the effect that even this government wouldn't last forever, but he took no notice and continued. "I have 3 children, all of them been through grammar school, and 2 of them married now with family. I shan't be satisfied till I've seen them settled overseas. In this country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man. I can already hear the chorus of execration. How dare I say such a horrible thing? How dare I stir up trouble and inflame feelings by repeating such a conversation? The answer is that I do not have the right not to do so. Here is a decent, ordinary fellow Englishman who in broad daylight, in my own town, says to me, his Member of Parliament, that his country will not be worth living in for his children. I simply do not have the right to shrug my shoulders and think about something else. What he is saying, thousands and hundreds of thousands are saying and thinking. Not throughout Great Britain, perhaps, but in the areas that are already undergoing the total transformation to which there is no parallel in 1,000 years of English history. In 15 or 20 years, on present trends, there will be in this country 3.5 million Commonwealth immigrants and their descendants. That is not my figure. That is the official figure given to Parliament by the spokesman of the Registrar General's office. There is no comparable official figure for the year 2000, but it must be in the region.
So this was said in 1968. So it's not so long ago, and we could make even worse prediction for the future. So he was seeing this in 1968, and I'm replaying at 346.
Of 5 to 7 million, approximately 1/10 of the whole population and approaching that of Greater London. Of course, it will not be evenly distributed from Margate to Aberystwyth and from Penzance to Aberdeen. Whole areas, towns and parts of towns across England will be occupied by sections of the immigrant and immigrant-descended population. As time goes on, the proportion of this total who are immigrant descendants, those born in England, who arrived here by exactly the same route as the rest of us, will rapidly increase. Already by 1985, the native-born would constitute the majority. It is this fact which creates the extreme urgency of action now, of just that kind of action which is hardest for politicians to take. Action where the difficulties lie in the present, but the evils to be prevented or minimized lie several parliaments ahead. The natural and rational first question with a nation confronted by such a prospect is to ask, how can its dimensions be reduced? Granted it be not wholly preventable, can it be limited, bearing in mind that numbers are of the essence? The significance and consequence of an alien element introduced into a country or population are profoundly different according to whether that element is 1% or 10%. The answers to the simple and rational question are equally simple and rational. By stopping or virtually stopping further inflow and by promoting the maximum outflow. Both answers are part of the official policy of the Conservative Party. It almost passes belief that at this moment 20 or 30 additional immigrant children are arriving from overseas in Wolverhampton alone every week. And that means 15 or 20 additional families a decade or two hence. Those whom the gods wish to destroy, they first make mad. We must be mad, literally mad, as a nation, to be permitting the annual inflow of some 50,000 dependents, who are, for the most part, the material of the future growth of the immigrant-descended population. It is like watching a nation busily engaged in heaping up its own funeral pyre. So insane are we, that we actually permit unmarried persons to immigrate for the purpose of founding a family, with spouses and fiancés whom they have never seen. Let no one suppose that the flow of dependents will automatically tail off. On the contrary, even at the present admission rate of only 5,000 a year by voucher, there is sufficient for a further 325,000 dependents per annum ad infinitum, without taking into account the huge reservoir of existing relations in this country, and I am making no allowance at all for fraudulent entry. In these circumstances, nothing will suffice but that the total inflow for settlement should be reduced at once to negligible proportions, and that the necessary legislative and administrative measures be taken without delay. I stress the words, for settlement. This has nothing to do with the entry of Commonwealth citizens, any more than of aliens, into this country. For the purposes of study or of improving their qualifications, like, for instance, the Commonwealth doctors who, to the advantage of their own countries, have enabled our hospital service to be expanded faster than would otherwise have been possible. These are not, and never have been, immigrants. I return to re-emigration. If all immigration ended tomorrow, the rate of growth of the immigrant and immigrant-descended population would be substantially reduced. But the prospective size of this element in the population would still leave the basic character of the national danger unaffected. This can only be tackled while a considerable proportion of...
So I'm posing at 825. What he's pointing to is the fact that even if we were to stop immigration, there is enough of a social mesh in most Western countries and enough of a birth rate advantage that the problem could still be occurring in many generations. And so if you look at the for example, in Canada, if you look at the birth rate of the Muslim population, it's almost one baby per woman higher than the native Canadians. And so we're talking about one baby higher per couple. With 10, 15 generation, you can have a 1% of the population or 5% of the population become a majority. All right, let's keep playing at 825.
The total still comprises persons who entered this country during the last 10 years or so. Hence the urgency of implementing now the second element of the Conservative Party's policy, the encouragement of re-emigration. Nobody can make an estimate of the numbers which, with generous grants and assistance, would choose either to return to their countries of origin or to go to other countries anxious to receive the manpower and the skills they represent. Nobody knows, because no such policy has yet been attempted. I can only say that even at present, immigrants in my own constituency from time to time come to me, asking if I can find them assistance to return home. If such a policy were adopted and pursued with the determination which the gravity of the alternative justifies, the resultant outflow could appreciably alter the prospects for the future. It can be no part of any policy that existing family should be kept divided. But there are two directions in which families can be reunited. And if our former and present immigration laws have brought about the division of families, albeit voluntary or semi-voluntary, we ought to be prepared to arrange for them to be reunited in their countries of origin. In short, suspension of immigration and encouragement of re-emigration hang together, logically and humanly, as two aspects of the same approach. The third element of the Conservative Party's policy is that all who are in this country as citizens should be equal before the law, and that there shall be no discrimination or difference made between them by public authority. As Mr. Heath has put it, we will have no first-class citizens and second-class citizens. This does not mean that the immigrant and his descendants should be elevated into a privileged or special class, or that the citizen should be denied his right to discriminate in the management of his own affairs between one fellow citizen and another.
That's a very important point. I'm at 1056. See, he had the concept that even if the state cannot discriminate, it has to be the case that people who make their own choices, people are free to choose. People are free to choose their girlfriend. People are free to choose their business partners. And what these warned us against was the possibility that the immigrant class become a favored class, which is exactly what happened. In countries like Canada, there is a sacralization of diversity so much that essentially if you're just a white heterosexual man, oh, you're so boring. But hey, look at this family. It's a black woman with a white man, or it's an Islamic, it's a Muslim couple with an adopted baby. All of this is being pushed by the state media, which is CBC and Radio-Canada, to really favor diversity. And the even in our constitution, in our Charter of Rights, there are special statutes for diversity. But again, who's not part of the diversity? Well, the white male, the atheist. It's like you need to be diverse in a certain direction. What he warned about in 1968 is the current state of civilization.
Well, and we saw what happened in America in 65, right? What was the number one lie that was told to the American citizens? It was that this will not change a thing, right? If we let the Immigration Act of 1965 happen, nothing will change. You will still remain the majority. Everyone's, the proportions of the demographics, everything will remain the same. It's not the case. And I think even, to some extent, Enoch Powell knew that, look, you can kind of say that, how would I put this? Maybe sometimes humans aren't smart enough for responsibility or freedom.
Yeah.
Maybe there does need to be some sort of constraint put on people, especially when you're having a multiracial, multicultural society. And he knew that in some way, shape, or form, this would limit the freedoms of the people already there, right? The people of that homeland. And he was a savant when it came to the problems that we're facing today.
He warns against immigrants becoming a protected class, which is literally the case in Canada, for example, probably becoming the case progressively in many European countries that have a huge public discourse, pro-diversity discourse, that even hides some facts from the public. For example, any sort of racial data being banned in France. And it's also the case through the social pressure that are imposed privately. So there's lots of pressure. For example, Starbucks pressuring its employees to behave in certain ways with people of different races. There was a shop recently where the employees got fired for refusing to serve someone after the shop was closed. So the time had already elapsed. The shop is closed, but there was a black woman asking to be served, and they got fired for refusing to serve after the hours of closing. So we have a system of pressure applying to people, just like Enoch Powell had been describing. So I'm playing again at 10:56.
Or that he should be subjected to inquisition as to his reasons and motives for behaving in one lawful manner rather than another. There could be no grosser misconception of the realities than is entertained by those who vociferously demand legislation, as they call it, against discrimination. Whether they be leader writers of the same kidney, and sometimes on the same newspapers, which year after year in the 1930s tried to blind this country to the rising peril which confronted it, or archbishops who live in palaces, faring delicately, with the bedclothes pulled right over their heads. They have got it exactly and diametrically wrong. The discrimination and the deprivation, the sense of alarm and resentment lies not with the immigrant population, but with those among whom they have come, and are still coming. This is why to enact legislation of the kind before pickup. This is why to enact legislation of the kind before Parliament at this moment is to risk throwing a match onto the gunpowder. The kindest thing that can be said about those who propose and support it is they know not what they do, and other rights of citizenship, to the exercise of which they have only gradually and still incompletely come. The Commonwealth immigrant came to Britain as a full citizen, to a country which knows no discrimination between one citizen and another, and he entered instantly into the possession of the rights of every citizen, from the vote to free treatment under the National Health Service. Whatever drawbacks attended the immigrants, and they were drawbacks which did not and do not make admission into Britain by hook or by crook appear less than desirable, arose not from the law, or from public policy, or from administration, but from those personal circumstances and accidents which cause, and always will cause, the fortunes and experience of one man to be different from another's. But while to the immigrant, entry to this country was admission to privileges and opportunities eagerly sought, the impact upon the existing population was very different. For reasons which they could not comprehend, and in pursuance of a decision by default, on which they were never consulted, they found themselves made strangers in their own country. They found their wives unable to obtain hospital beds in childbirth, their children unable to obtain school places, their homes and neighborhoods changed beyond recognition, their plans and prospects for the future defeated. At work, they found that employers hesitated to apply to the immigrant worker the standards of discipline and competence required of the native-born worker. They began to hear, as time went by.
I'm posing at 1441. This is one of the subversive effect of positive treatment and of affirmative action. It is the feeling in the host population or the native population that they have to work harder than the immigrant to get the same level of care. And any form of affirmative action, not only the explicit ones, but those that are implicit, that are made every day by people who are scared to apply their own principle fairly across people because they're scared of the accusation of racism. That is killing a nation. It is telling the natives you are worth less even if you work more.
Well, and also, I mean, if you have a nation that's based off of equality under the law or equality in the application of the law and such institutions, and at the same time, you are countering that, right? You are technically treating people special. It will create such a divide within the people, and it will create nothing but hostility, nothing but nervousness, nothing but fear, nothing but chaos. It may not be instant.
Let's play at 1441. We're almost done.
More and more voices which told them that they were now the unwanted. On top of this, they now learn that a one-way privilege is to be established by Act of Parliament, a law which cannot and is not intended to operate to protect them or redress their grievances, is to be enacted to give the stranger, the disgruntled, and the agent provocateur the power to pillory them for their private actions. In the hundreds upon hundreds of letters I received when I last spoke on this subject 2 or 3 months ago, there was one striking feature which was largely new and which I find ominous. All members of Parliament are used to the typical anonymous correspondent, but what surprised and alarmed me was the high proportion of ordinary, decent, sensible people writing a rational and often well-educated letter, who believed that they had to omit their address, because it was dangerous to have committed themselves to paper to a member of Parliament agreeing with the views I had expressed, and that they would risk either penalties or reprisals if they were known to have done so. The sense of being a persecuted minority, which is growing among ordinary English people in the areas of the country which are affected, is something that those without direct experience can hardly imagine. I am going to allow just one of those hundreds of people to speak for me. She did give her name and address, which I have detached from the letter which I am about to read. She was writing from Northumberland about something which is happening at this moment in my own constituency. 8 years ago, in a respectable street in Wolverhampton, a house was sold to a Negro. Now only one white, a woman old-age pensioner, lives there. This is her story. She lost her husband and both her sons in the war. So she turned her 7-roomed house, her only asset, into a boarding house. She worked hard and did well, paid off her mortgage, and began to put something by for her old age. Then the immigrants moved in. With growing fear, she saw one house after another taken over. The quiet streets became a place of noise and confusion. Regretfully, her white tenants moved out. The day after the last one left, she was awakened at 7 a.m. by two Negroes who wanted to use her phone to contact their employer. When she refused, as she would have refused any stranger at such an hour, she was abused and feared she would have been attacked but for the chain on her door. Immigrant families have tried to rent rooms in her house, but she always refused. Her little store of money went, and after paying her rates, she had less than £2 per week. She went to apply for a rate reduction and was seen by a young girl who, on hearing she had a 7-roomed house, suggested she should let part of it. When she said the only people she could get were Negroes, the girl said, "Racial prejudice won't get you anywhere in this country." So she went home. The telephone is her lifeline. Her family pay the bill and help her out as best they can. Immigrants have offered to buy her house as a price which the prospective landlord would be able to recover from his tenants in weeks, or at most in a few months. She is becoming afraid to go out. Windows are broken. She finds excreta pushed through her letterbox. When she goes to the shops, she is followed by children, charming, wide-grinning pickaninnies. They cannot speak English, but one word they know. Racialist, they chant. When the new race relations bill is passed, this woman is convinced she will go to prison. And is she so wrong? I begin to wonder. The other dangerous delusion from which those who are willfully or otherwise blind to reality suffer is summed up in the word integration. To be integrated into a population means to become, for all practical purposes, indistinguishable from its other members. Now, at all times, where there are marked physical...
So I'm posing at 1927. On this whole story, I will say this is a perfect metaphor to what is happening right now in society, which is you get bullied for liberties that you should have had. You should have the liberty to choose whoever you rent to, whoever you sell to. But this woman got bullied for choosing. And so that's a perfect description of a much wider phenomenon, which is the loss of liberty of choice in a society that is willing to use bullying to impose diversity on you.
That's the problem, isn't it? Well, that's the problem we're still facing. We're facing it today. This woman was just, and I hate that story. I was just listening to this and I'm just like, okay, here it comes, right? Because these are the people that no one really considers. I mean, you look at abuse in nursing homes, and you look at the way that in-group preferences are, blacks towards blacks, whites towards whites. But when you look at cross-group preferences, they're very, very low. And there's a lot of abuse, and there's a kind of a lot of negativity to say that goes that way. But I mean, I was just talking to someone, and I was kind of just telling them, like, we just want to be left alone. That's all we want, right? It was that if we see a certain world and we don't want to interact with it, you just want to be left alone. You want to be able to remove yourself from that part of society, and we're no longer being allowed to do that. I don't know what to think about. I mean, that's why the ethno-state talk comes up, right? Because we're trying to think of any way that we can officially separate ourselves from this multicultural, multiracial society. And, laws won't allow it.
Absolutely. So let's keep looking for the last 4 minutes at 1927.
Physical differences, especially of color. Integration is difficult, though over a period, not impossible. There are among the Commonwealth immigrants who have come to live here in the last 15 years or so many thousands whose wish and purpose is to be integrated and whose every thought and endeavor is bent in that direction. But to imagine that such a thing enters the heads of a great and growing majority of immigrants and their descendants is a ludicrous misconception, and a dangerous one to boot. We are on the verge here of a change. Hitherto, It has been force of circumstance and of background which has rendered the very idea of integration inaccessible to the greater part of the immigrant population, that they never conceived or intended such a thing, and that their numbers and physical concentration meant the pressures towards integration which normally bear upon any small minority did not operate. Now we are seeing the growth of positive forces acting against integration, of vested interests in the preservation and sharpening of racial and religious differences, with a view to the exercise of actual domination, first over fellow immigrants, and then over the rest of the population. The cloud no bigger than a man's hand, that can so rapidly overcast the sky, has been visible recently in Wolverhampton, and has shown signs of spreading quickly. The words I am about to use, verbatim, as they appeared in the local press on 17th of February, are not mine, but those of a Labour Member of Parliament who is a minister in the present government. The Sikh community's campaign to maintain customs inappropriate in Britain is much to be regretted. Working in Britain, particularly in the public services, they should be prepared to accept the terms and conditions of their employment. To claim special communal rights, or should one say rights, leads to a dangerous fragmentation within society. This communalism is a canker. Whether practiced by one colour or another, it is to be strongly condemned. All credit to John Stonehouse for having had the insight to perceive that, and the courage to say it. For these dangerous and divisive elements, the legislation proposed in the Race Relations Bill is the very pabulum they need to flourish. Here is the means of showing that the immigrant communities can organise to consolidate their members, to agitate and campaign against their fellow citizens, and to overawe and dominate the rest with the legal weapons which the ignorant and the ill-informed have provided. As I look ahead, I am filled with foreboding. Like the Roman, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood. That tragic and intractable phenomenon, which we watch with horror on the other side of the Atlantic, but which is interwoven with the history and existence of the states itself, is coming upon us here by our own volition and our own neglect. Indeed, it has all but come. In numerical terms, it will be of American proportions long before the end of the century. Only resolute and urgent action will avert it even now. Whether there will be the public will to demand and obtain that action, I do not know. All I know is that to see and not to speak would be the great betrayal.
All right, so the end is very impressive in terms of what he defines as communalism, which is essentially what Sargon might call today identity politics, or might call today collectivism. And it's quite impressive because we live in the loss of Enoch Powell. We live in the world that hasn't done what Enoch Powell wanted to do. And there are a few things to say here. So Enoch Powell was right in most of the things that he stated there. He saw through the future. It's not like I'm not particularly stunned. However, it was a good evaluation of what was to happen for the next 40 years. And we are today living into the prediction of Enoch Powell. And he was right largely. And most importantly, the very same speech can be done today. The very same speech, we are just progressing through it, but all of the statements and all of his prediction could be restated in 40 years and in 100 years. And so his statements remain valid today. We are just progressing through the slow decomposition of liberties that he described. We are progressing through the collectivization and the use of the state, as he described, as a tool that was allowed to exist by those who were not informed, who were ill-informed. And so people don't realize, but the state gains power, and the state gains power in particular due to the democratic control from the base of society, the poorest people, and their alliance with many minorities. And so the state of liberty is being chipped on decade after decade, and partly due to the fact that we live in a society where the base keeps filling itself with people who are not successful on the free market, or literally people who come from other places and who start from scratch in our countries. So what do you retain about the end of the speech, Kayla?
Well, even I just want to tell people what this speech was a response to, right? It was a response to the Race Relations Act of 1968, and that was it was pretty much like it was the equivalent of the Civil Rights Act here in the U.S., where you couldn't deny someone housing, employment, public services based on race, ethnicity, national origins, and they did this to, quote, promote a harmonious community relation. That's what they were doing. And this is the same thing that always happens, right? And he saw this happening. He knew that it was something that would actually lead to bloodshed. And I mean, that was a big deal when he said that. Everyone thought he was exaggerating. He was being melodramatic, kind of using that phrase, rivers of blood. But I think it was the only way that he could really get his point across, that this will cause conflict. The more that you try to force different people together, and you're not even trying to let them come together naturally.
And on the rivers of blood, he didn't specify when that would happen, but having a growing minority that demands more and more, that uses the state more and more to enact its will on the government, and that eventually uses its voting power to get more migrants in. And then we could think of the rivers of blood as all of the things that are being reported from the UK gangs, grooming gangs, rapes, murder, all of the Islamic terrorism that we've seen for the last year. And so I don't know if Enoch Powell had such a precise view of it, but he saw something coming that we can easily put on current events.
Well, and that's why I thought you would like this, because it was similar to, like I said before, right? It was similar to when you watched Rockwell and you said, this guy was saying stuff 50 years ago, and yet it was still applicable even today. And I thought you'd kind of see the the common thread between what Enoch was talking about over 50 years ago and what we're seeing today. So
I was to say, to compare with Rockwell, since you bring it, I think that Rockwell was much more intelligent, like per academic type of intelligence. I think that Rockwell was seeing through something that I would not have expected any politician of his time to see. He had an understanding of biology that was extremely fine. Here I see a good politician, and I agree with what he states, but I'm not blown away by it the way I was blown away by Commander Rockwell.